Good evening. My name is Luis Daniel Munoz. I am a medical doctor, also previous gubernatorial candidate in the state of Rhode Island. You're joining us here on Pump Up the Volume, where our aim is to amplify the voices of community. And what that translates into is asking the questions, pushing back against the status quo and establishments that oftentimes are misleading the public about what is really going on, or at times what is actually not going on. Joining me are my fellow co-host, Scott Rotunda from 990 WBOB. Scott is an independent media expert and also someone who is actively involved in politics at the community level, at the municipal level, at the state level, and also has his pulse on the national front as well. We also have Mr. Pat Ford, the founder of the Coalition Radio Network that we're streaming through today, and co-founder of the Libertarian Party here in the state of Rhode Island. We are three individuals, and we have our different approaches, we have our different ideas, and what we try to create is a safe environment to have healthy discourse, and at times to really ask more questions than present answers. And that's just the nature of growing. And so today, what we will focus on really is what the nature of progress is. And I know that's a heavy question, and it may seem very superficial given that progress is thrown out by politicians time and time again. But what's interesting about words is, if you actually care to capture the nuance of those words in the context of different communities, it may lead you on an exploratory path, on a journey to better understand how to bring people together. And so today we want to capture some of those nuances from urban core Rhode Island to rural Rhode Island, whether it's clean energy, whether it's health equity, or even social justice. What I'm going to be asking my fellow co-hosts today is to think about and present a situation, policy issue that may in fact have two sides that are not necessarily distant from one another, but are different in how they implement what is considered to be progress. And so I'm going to start just to kind of lay the groundwork, and I'll let Scott and Pat kind of think about what they'd like to bring up today. But I find it interesting when we talk about protecting the climate and the environment, and the fact that we are facing an existential threat, and the question is whether behavior modifications and the things that we do is enough, right, to stop this cliff that we're about to go over. But in the process, that's the big fear, right? And then the big question about our role and contribution to keeping the environment healthy. For putting this in the context of urban core versus rural Rhode Island, what our transition to renewable energies, at what cost will it come? And it's not an answer I'm giving you today, but it's a question I'm posing. We have poverty in parts of Providence. We have utility rates that continue to go up without any control measures or without administrations that are willing to capitate or fight back. And yet the transition to renewables comes at a cost primarily because of the cost of the technology, of the infrastructure, right? And the likelihood that that technology is really not at a state where it's as sustainable when you compare it to traditional forms of energy. So does that mean we shouldn't transition? No. But the question is, how do we do that transition responsibly to ensure that we're also keeping the most vulnerable communities safe in that they're able to pay their utility bills and hopefully even have rates that are reduced. On the other hand, let's also think about, Exeter, West Greenwich. We have South County, and, when we talk about renewables, oftentimes the technology that everyone leans on is solar. So you have a community that wants to protect the environment, but wants to do so as well in the form of conservation, of keeping green spaces safe, of reducing the instances in which you have hundreds of acres of trees cut down for solar farms. And so progress in terms of protecting the environment and also transitioning to renewables could also mean something significantly different for Exeter, West Greenwich. So who's right, who's wrong here? at the end of the day, it seems like both communities really, in terms of like significant number of people in those communities, want us to transition to renewables, want to protect the environment. But how does a state administration in Rhode Island actually create initiatives and policies that can capture the nuances of those two communities based on their needs, right? That one community's need to control utility rates and to have a cost of living that is sustainable for their daily lives. Another community's need to preserve green spaces. And so that's a question, that's an idea that's trying to capture the nuance of progress in South County as compared to Providence County. But, I'd love to just hand this off to Scott and Pat. And, you can feel free to either continue on what I presented or present something totally different. But today, hopefully, I'm hoping we can provide some food for thought. Scott, why don't you go next?
Sure. Well, in terms of what progress is, I actually want to talk about what progress is not, and it's something that's been happening very recently, which is access to charter schools. Right? It's a situation where I don't think any of us on this conference here want to abolish public schools or defund them or anything like this. I know. That was I threw that out for you purposely. That's some red meat there, Pat. We do have the option of charter schools for areas where the public schools are failing, where parents can send their kids to the charter schools, and in fact, you do have underprivileged communities such as Pawtucket, where you have parents of children from disadvantaged parts of town that are now learning that we're basically freezing the amount of people that can apply for the charter schools. And these same senators that hold themselves out there as progressives and liberals are the ones leading the charge to effectively, freeze out the charter schools. Like I said, on the one hand, I get, that they don't want to starve out the public schools. Okay, but disenfranchising students, minority students, white students, students of any creed from disadvantaged communities to the access to a charter school where they can have a better chance at the starting blocks. It just flies in the face of what progress is. And what kills me is some of these very same senators hold themselves out as progressive. To me, being progressive and progress is not just putting a Black Lives Matter sign out in your front yard. It's actually doing things. It's about getting opportunities to students of color and to students in disadvantaged communities. So to me, you have some people in state government right now who their very actions are at cross currents to everything that they're holding themselves out for, saying that they stand for every 2 years when they beg for votes. So sorry to kind of be the negative here, but I just wanted to point out what progress is not, in my opinion.
You see, my priority is the quality of children's education. I really don't care who delivers it. I am not bound, married, mated with the philosophy of how it's delivered. It's irrelevant to me. The first issue is the quality of education. The second issue, closely behind, is the cost. So at least we're not just spending money for the sake of spending money. I get down to one very simple fact, and that is you can send a child to LaSalle for somewhere between $15,000, $16,000 and change. We pay over $20,000 a year to send children to the Providence public school system. That's a fact. That's undeniable. Now, are there issues underneath that? Absolutely. Is there a contention that there are children who are, quote unquote, left behind at the Providence schools who are not, quote unquote, well, teachable in a quote unquote private school? Well, I simply don't believe that for a minute. It's the quality of the people who are doing the teaching, and it's the working conditions and the cost structure which have been established. We too often look at public schools in Rhode Island as, I always say, a necessary evil, if you will, looked upon by the people who profit from it, of which there are many, as sort of a necessary inconvenience, a necessary evil to justify the real importance, which is the entire, if you will, industrial educational complex here in Rhode Island. The first priority is not educating the children, or simply people wouldn't stand for it. So if you're married to this concept that a public education is the only education, while in fact you are sending your children, as is so many times the case, to private or parochial schools, non-public education, well then balderdash. As far as I'm concerned, we should end public education because it's a miserable failure. It has not worked. That's all that should matter. Has it worked? No. Are we so committed to a social construct that we're willing to engage in the soft bigotry of diminished expectations? Apparently we are. And yet that's seen somehow as a virtue. It's not a virtue. If you're a participant in the Providence Public Schools, then you should be ashamed of yourself. Because although I'm sure there's some very hardworking people, the net result is not good. In fact, the net result overall is so astonishingly terrible that I don't know how folks can even justify their existence there. So we can keep on going, being terrible or terrible, but damn it, we sure are virtuous in our terribleness. End it now. Just stop it. Phase it out over the next few years. We will find places for children to go to school. We will spend less money, and we will get a better education. It's undeniable. And for all the folks who talk about special ed kids, well, then we need more competition in the special ed space to drive down costs there. Right now, there are very few places where you can send a child for issues like, well, just look down the range, the panoply of available choices on IEPs now. If, in fact, your public school system's not being judged on how few IEPs, as was the case in Bristol Warren, and not issuing them. So let's just stop it. Cut the crap. This week we're treated to the notion that there's no, the teachers have no confidence in the department, Rhode Island Department of Education and the head. I've never had any confidence. I don't know why this is such a shock to people. But what are your thoughts, fellas?
Yeah, as I'm listening, you didn't present a third nuanced scenario, but you did build on what Scott was saying, Pat. So since we're gonna build on this, I'm gonna have to push back a little and say, if we're really talking about progress, then we need to start having a sophisticated approach around what that progress should look like. What are the incremental steps? And I don't mean incrementalism in the way that an establishment might use it to stunt any action at all. I'm talking about the fact that we have a formulary, that when you look at the funding formula for education and you literally look at the equation that's been designed, and you can see how a simple square root was used to create a system that does not adequately fund schools that are actually in greater need, that cannot produce the revenue to actually fund themselves, right? That to support their improvement, versus municipalities that can produce that revenue, proportionately wise, are paying the same, are contributing the same amount to education as Providence, as an example. So we can address the funding formula. There are models across states. I spoke to a professor at URI. There are models that have funding formulas that are fair. There are models that have, for instance, examples that might indicate that Providence should separate out of the municipalities included in the funding formula and be funded completely separately from every other municipalities. There are states that have shown that to work. There are states that have shown that for the non-traditional education that takes place, whether you want to call it informal, if it's soft business skills and after school programs, or formal education like vocational skills and after school programs, that can also be funded through an education formula if our formula is rewritten. And so there are actual steps that we can take in both that formula and in policy to start investing more heavily in students directly, to start investing more heavily in the books and in the technologies that are helping them to learn. If there's anything we learned with COVID-19 is that the lack of technology infrastructure and the lack of exposure of students to that technology has led to negative consequences when distance learning has taken ultimately effect, right? So my point is that we have an antiquated system where our dollars are not only not being proportionally allocated, but when they are directed to students, that actually today means directed at third-party professional development services that are teaching teachers so that they can remain credentialed, and those teachers are actually not being given really the laxity in curriculum to implement what they're learning and change in a way that's as rapid as you might see in a charter school, right? And so I'm not saying that that addresses or captures the issues of just low quality individual teachers at times, just like there are some physicians that are not great physicians, right? Things like that happen, but there are progressive steps that we can take. And, Scott, what do you think about this? I mean, you're a numbers guy. I mean, what are your thoughts on just the formula or generally anything else?
Well, I mean, to stick to a formula, first of all, you're right. As a numbers guy, I mean, you can make anything look good on paper. Okay. Pure communism can look good on paper. Pure capitalism can look good on paper. The fact that you're using a formula to dole out education dollars, to me, borders on the absurd. Okay, there are just some things that, and it might be heresy for a financial professional like me to say, but there are some things that just can't be measured in equations and put on a sheet of paper. And when we're talking about potentially holding back generations of students just because their zip code doesn't line up with a damn formula, I think it illustrates my point.
Luis, Dr. Munoz, I don't know how more blunt I can be. We spend, regardless of the source, I don't care, let's forget about the source for the time being. Regardless of the source, we spend more money and get less quality in public schools than we do in non-public schools. That is an undeniable fact at this point on every level. The beauty of the Johns Hopkins review, the beauty of RICAS, and I'm not a fan of RICAS, but at a certain point we have to accept some type of, for the time being, until someone comes along with something better, and I'm open to that, there has to be a baseline analysis. It's not the money. We waste countless millions for all sorts of reasons. But that's the symptom to the disease. The disease is government. The disease is government being unaccountable for any level of competition. The disease is the constant that we must have public schools. Really? Why? For most of this nation's history, we managed to do without. And a significant part of the educational system. Again, I'll point to the most successful product in America right now, which is higher education. College. We attract students from all over the planet because we have the finest universities on the planet. There's some exceptions. I mean, there's some great schools in Europe and Japan, all that. But generally speaking, in terms of volume, we have the best schools on the planet, which is why people spend millions and pay full boat to come here. And what's the one thing most of those schools have in common, with a few notable exceptions? They're private. They're just better. People have to compete to go work there. People have to compete to keep their jobs there. People have to compete to go there. And that can be true over any, if you will, variety of education, whether it be quote unquote special education, whether it be for children who are dyslexic, for children who have ADD, ADHD, whatever. Competition makes it better. And hitching ourselves to continually, after a full generation or two of failure, again, what's the racism here? The notion that we are going to tie our children to in minority communities to failed public schools, and that has nothing to do with funding. Nothing. The federal government spends a fortune here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, buddy.
So let me. Yeah. But I just look. When lottery systems are the only way for students to get an opportunity, I can tell you that is a framework that has been used and designed on the backs of a capitalist system that was founded on an enslaved people. So, I mean, I'm just saying, Pat, you're using that word racism, and I just want to be very intentional here with the words we use around education, because I'm willing to bring it back to another level. So let me just bring it back, but I just wanted to point that out. I could say that the charter school lottery system has an issue with it, just as much as you're saying that there's an issue with the disenfranchisement of public school students. Okay, so we can see both sides of this. I also want to point out, though, and highly, schools with large endowments have the luxury of doing whatever they want. Brown University included, Harvard University included,
I'm not talking
Ivy League,
about.
sister Ivy League.
I'm not talking about that.
But what I'm saying, Pat, is, but we have a lot of students in state schools that leave with bachelor's degrees and cannot find a job.
Absolutely.
So yeah. So if the measure that we have for colleges is success in finding a job, then I would say that just generally as a nation, we are also struggling on that front as well.
I don't define success in college as finding a job, even remotely. The purpose of college is not to find a job. The purpose of college is to get an education. The purpose of K-12 is to get an education. Right? Again, I'm with you. This whole bit about lotteries for charter schools, nonsense. There's a simple way to get rid of that. Get rid of charter schools. Government should not be involved in education at any level. They if there was a track record for success, scoreboard, as they like to say on sports radio, right? But there isn't. There just isn't. I sound exasperated because I've been having this conversation with people in the state for a couple of years, and guess what? We just had another crappy year with kids in crappy schools, run by some very well-meaning people, but ultimately the product is terrible. The product's not geared for kids who are ESL. The product's not geared to them. For kids who significant number of children who have learn differently, the product's not geared to them. We've just thrown together this mishmash, and under the aren't we swell? We have public schools where people can go to crappy schools for free, but they're not free. Federal government spends an enormous amount of money in the state. Private institutions spend an enormous amount of money in the state. The only thing in common is that they all contribute to a failed product. And charter schools aren't the answer. The answer is to create the same type of framework that universities operate under, where they have to compete for the best students, or they have to compete for students that fit into their niche, their category. And that, in the case of colleges, go ahead, buddy.
I want to add to that a little bit. I think part of the problem is lack of accountability. So we, the three of us, all have jobs. If I do terrible in my job with the finances of my company, I'm accountable. I'll be fired. Pat, in your job, if you don't sell for an extended period of time, you'll get fired. Dr. Munoz, if you prescribe the wrong medications or administer the wrong shots after a certain amount of time, you'll be fired. And when we have the Johns Hopkins report come out saying, I forget how few of the students read at grade level, or that they graduate and read at elementary school level. And the problem is there's been no accountability. And I think a lot of that stems towards, job security. So I think, way back when, teaching was almost a patronage job, right? So if you were friends with the mayor, or you quote unquote knew somebody, you could get a job teaching. And when that mayor left office, or you were no longer friends with that person, you could be switched out pretty quickly. So that's part of the reason why we have, teachers unions and education unions to protect people's jobs so they don't get fired on a whim. Where I have the issue is, again, there's no or little to no accountability anymore. To Pat's point, how many years in a row have crappy results been turned in, and I haven't seen mass firings as you would in the public sector? And I don't think the answer to that is necessarily standardized testing, because everybody works at a different level. But there's got to be something. There's got to be, if we're going to go with the public school system, that there has to be the caveat. If we're going to take away charter schools, then there has to be accountability. And churning out kids with high school diplomas that may as well be written on toilet paper because they can't read at a 6th grade level is terrible. It dooms those kids to another generation of failure, and it's unconscionable.
So my question to both of you is, and then I'll cede the floor. Just quickly, my question is, why do we keep beating the dead horse? Why do we keep flogging the same failed concept? This is not new. Failed public schools have been with us for a while. And all sorts of experts have weighed in. All sorts of money's been spent on this and that. Remember the race to the top, or we called it here the race to the bottom? Yeah, that was why continue to invest in failure and lose yet another generation of children? Again, the delivery system of a product shouldn't matter. We don't care how milk is made. We don't care how, bread is made. We go to the store and we look at the bread that works for us. At a certain level, why are we obsessed with who's in charge?
So
why?
Yeah. So I mean, look, actually, we do monitor the way bread's made. We do make sure that there are certain minerals in bread. We do enrich bread, right? I mean, I'm just going to use your analogy.
I
We
no,
have a
actually,
role-
actually, I went to, the last time I brought bread this week was from a private vendor, and I got to tell you, it was delicious, and I have no idea what was in it, and they conform to nothing other than hygienic standards. Let's look at it the same way.
They put plenty of folate in bread these days, and I'm going to use your metaphor, Pat, because the bottom line is we live in a society where there are regulations and expectations around quality. And so you're making a quality point. So I'm going to address the quality point you're making around education from my perspective. Yes, an education system should be held accountable, but an education system should also be sustainable. And if it is not sustainable, but clearly sustainable, meaning that there are protections, there are pillars in place that system will not collapse on the population that it is serving, then who's going to be accountable if it does collapse? That is a question with the private industry. We saw that when these, was it Catherine Gregg or something, these colleges with associate programs started to open up early on. This is before Phoenix and online schools, and several of them closed down, right? And then those individuals have associate's degrees that are from institutions that no longer exist. We have seen private education systems propped up and collapse. We see public charters and we also see independent charters. We see independent charters driven by a community that sees that there's a need in the short term to address quality with a hope that the public school system will learn from independent charters. Then we see corporately managed charter schools that are scaling independent of any changes in the public school system. Their aim is to scale. And so as they scale, the question for me always becomes, what is the end goal for that company and what protective measures are in place to ensure that if that corporate company managing the charter school for one reason or the other fails, that school system, that element of the public school system is still sustainable. So you can talk about accountability, and I'm with you 100%, to the extent that if a family member wants their kid in a charter school from an equity standpoint, that parent that wants their children in a charter school should be able, frankly, if I were them, I understand they want the greatest opportunity, but there are thousands of parents, they will not be able to get their students in charter school.
Why not? Why not open up? No, we don't need a system. What we need is a free market where people are able to, like the university market, open up schools privately, all right, and then give the consumer a choice in where to spend their educational dollar. That's what we need. You're right. There is probably a rate of failure amongst private education, but that is infinitesimally smaller than the near complete failure here. Just let's take Rhode Island, for example. A handful of schools are bragging. Cumberland schools are bragging because 54%, I think it was 54% of their students met math, I'll call it acceptability for their grade level. 54%, which means you've got a 46% failure in arguably one of the quote unquote, by Rhode Island terms, better systems. So right, let's assume there's a 10% failure, a 20% failure in private schools. Where will people go if those schools fail? They'll go to other schools because given the opportunity to monetize education independently of state and federal government, people will go to where the best education is. It's quantifiable, it's verifiable. The only situation we've got right now is people are locked into failure. Absolute 100% failure.
Pat, you are assuming that people can afford. We see this with Head Start. We see this with Head Start.
LaSalle is $16,000 a year.
Pat, we saw the dismantling of the Head Start programs and now have a current state of childcare in Rhode Island where you need $6,000 to $24,000 a year if you have 1 to 2 children in order to place them in childcare that you would have normally been able to access at a sliding scale for less than 50% of the lower rate previously. So we talk about access, we talk about quality, we talk about accountability and sustainability. When we talk about access and quality, we're talking about the lens of the parent, right? So who can deny, Pat? People want their children to be in healthy environments where they're learning. But when we talk about accountability and we talk about sustainability, you cannot separate those two things. And that's what you're trying to do by assuming that complete privatization of education is going to provide an equitable education system that's accessible and high quality for everyone, history has proven that that is not the case.
History has proven that if it was a 5%, Dr. Munoz, if it was a 10% success rate, it would be better than the public schools in the state. I'm not sure anyone here is willing to accept the totality of the failure of Rhode Island schools. And again, that's not me. That's Johns Hopkins University. Read the report. So somehow the notion is that there might be a failure, or there might be some type of dissonance, or there might be some noise. I don't know if it's credible when you compare the only thing that's guaranteed in this state is that if you get a public education, there's a 50, 60, 70% rate, it's going to be worthless. Absolutely worthless. So we can continue to tell people that we're going to look for equity in this or that. It doesn't exist now. Anything now is better than what could be. And again, I'll point out, there are plenty, I'm not talking about the Moses Browns of the world, but there are plenty of private educational sources that are charging students at full value. That's assuming they don't get any sort of scholarship, for less money than Providence schools cost per system, and a number of schools cost per system. In over a dozen states nationally, students are essentially given a debit card, if you will, to go buy their education elsewhere, as long as they opt out of the public education. And in most states, it's been a booming success. And I'll point to Arizona, which is one of the poorest states in the nation. Arizona, the early rollout of the program was dedicated and directed towards Indian reservations, Native Americans, where they jumped at the opportunity to go anywhere for school and saw exponential increases in performance within a couple of years. Right? Or we can continue to say, well, you're looking for something that doesn't exist in its current form. So let's just trash the current form and save some people's lives.
No, we started this with what is progress, and does it capture the nuances of the community that progress is for? And you are talking to me about Arizona. So what I'm saying, Pat, is I'm going to capture one of the statements you made, which essentially denies the probability or likelihood that we can achieve equity. That's where I disagree. And because the fact of the matter is, the nuance of what you think progress is versus I think progress is ultimately weighed on a disagreement in that area. You cannot take the size of a population of a reservation and the success that they achieved by allocating a specific amount of resource and say it's exactly comparable to what we can achieve by doing the same thing with the urban core in Rhode Island. And so, look, you're not going to find disagreement in me in saying children and their parents should pursue the path of least resistance that gets them towards greatest economic opportunity. Absolutely. But as leaders and as just people that need to shift, change, modify, dismantle, and rebuild or build anew the systems of education that we have in Rhode Island, like we can't found whatever is coming next, Pat, on this idea that you just said, which is that equity is not achievable, it's unrealistic. Because if that's the case, what are we doing? What are you arguing then?
What I'm arguing is that it's unrealistic to expect any performance improvement at schools when we simply continue to do the same thing. There is people keep hoping. They're willing to listen. Folks are willing to allow another generation of children to be test tubes, if you will, petri dishes for the latest educational experiment when they're surrounded in this nation by educational success elsewhere for less money. So, and listen, I'm not even saying turn the money back to taxpayers, God forbid, right? Why? Just let's use the money elsewhere. And in the meantime, why do we you're holding the school, the potential replacement for the failed schools of Rhode Island to a higher standard than the current schools? Why are you willing to continue to accept abject failure? Not my words.
Actually, when we talked about progress and capturing what steps could be taken, I actually talked about the formula. I actually talked about after-school programs, informal and formal vocational training. I actually talked about the difference of corporate charters and independent charters and how they were founded on the different value sets. And I actually talked about the antiquated approach that we have to what it means to invest dollars today in students, which is through this idea of professional development for teachers versus investing in actual infrastructure, books, and technology that the students will have access to and in their hands. So I actually talked about what some charter schools are actually already doing. But I talked about it in the context of how we can do that in the public school system. And what you said, Pat, is that equity is unrealistic and that we should take a completely private model because competition alone will somehow satisfy the needs of all society. And I disagree with you.
It does it in virtually every other aspect of life. Virtually every other aspect of life. Only in certain functions of government do we preclude competition from the private sector. Listen, I mean, all you have to do is look at our automobile industry. I mean, yeah, is there oversight, safety oversight? Yeah. But ultimately, they had to simultaneously respond to government demands and market needs and make a car that people would buy. And that happened in a variety of parts of the world where it's been controlled with a means of production, if you will, or controlled by government. It's inevitably a failure. Look at our fighter programs here in the United States. Hey, again, we can continue, and Uncle, all right? I don't care about charter schools. I want the entire system gone. I don't understand why we would expect the Rhode Island Department of Education, after how many years of collapse, to suddenly have a deathbed conversion to competence. The entire model is wrong. In many places in this country and in a significant part of our history, a quality education was delivered to people without the oversight of the Federal Department of Education. Get rid of that. Trash that instantly. And for all the other kids who actually want to learn and their parents want to learn, which is probably 99 and what do they say in the Dove commercial, 99 and 4,400%, because all kids are great kids and all kids have talent, then get them the hell out of these warehouses, because that's all these schools are.
Pat, we're, we can't have a selective memory here about history. Okay. The systems and any historical evidence that you're pointing out, it's either some microcosm, some small sample population, or if you're talking about 10, 20 years ago of anything that it used to be, it wasn't for everyone that looked like me. So at the end of the day, we really need to understand that in an experiment that's controlled, things work out at times to our benefit. And charter schools, given the size that they are, and even some private schools, given the size that they are and the population they're serving, can demonstrate quality measures faster and more consistently than larger populations that have more variation. I believe that even with a private school, if it grows to the size of or in terms of the population it serves, to what Providence school system is now, or Pawtucket school system, we would see the same amount of variation. The systems would normalize under what you might call human error. You would still have teachers that vary in quality. You would still have curriculums that, because of changing cultures, are not able to meet the needs of the needs of students. So, like, at the end of the day, Pat, you are selectively choosing examples that work, but every time I bring it back to what Rhode Island needs now, you say dismantle instead of saying what progress could be in terms of the incremental steps we can take.
The biggest difference is if, in fact, if the school, in a private market, if the schools don't meet the needs, and it could be any one of a number of societal, educational needs, behavioral needs, whatever, if they simply don't meet the needs, they go bye-bye. And in a free market model, other schools are allowed to open. The big difference between now and the future is that these schools these independent schools that open up. And when I say private schools, I'm not talking about Moses Brown. I'm talking about in disruptive entrepreneurial efforts, often conducted by teachers who are tired of living a lifetime of failure. So if schools fail, they go away. These schools right now don't go away. They never go away. They're cancers.
No, and what I'm saying is that going away is not doing anything good for a community that needs consistency and sustainability.
We've got consistency. It's failure.
No, Pat. Wait. It's not funny.
No, it's failure. I said. I didn't say it's funny. No, it's not funny at all. I'm the one who's so upset about it. It's failure. That's what's consistent.
And what I'm saying, Pat, is I'm talking about sustainability. I'm talking about sustainable systems And the issue with a lot of people that push progress down on communities is they are not thinking about how to create a sustainable system. So, and I'm going to be very, very general here, Pat, because what you're doing today is a little bit of that, like pushing an idea down, assuming that it works for everyone, independent of the cost or risk that it inherently is in that idea, is not. How can it be progress for the people? How can a school closing down, or the risk of a school closing down being that much greater than what is public school systems risk is for closing down, be good for the people? You can talk about quality of education, but what about just literally having the building open for students to attend a school? This is what I'm saying, Pat. This is where I disagree with you.
Here's an idea of what is progress, just in broad strokes here. Like you said, like pushing progress down. It sounds to me like a top-down process. And how dare the people at the top in the echelons of power think that they know what progress is? Why not have communities, disadvantaged or underprivileged communities, push it from the bottom up? To tell us what you need. To tell the people in power, because they don't know, and it doesn't mean that they're bad people. It means they just don't know. Have it pushed from the bottom up for these communities to say, this is what we need in terms of education. This is what we need for affordable housing. And affordable housing isn't 5 people in a 2-room, apartment. What is affordable housing so that people can live like human beings, so that they can have the education to be on the starting blocks with everybody else. To have those communities tell us what is needed and listen, not just at election time, but all the time.
This current government let's talk about affordable housing for just a second. Scott, this current government that's in place in Rhode Island continues to subsidize the construction of luxury housing with no interest, low interest loans, with generous tax deferments. And we're shocked that no one builds middle income housing or housing that's geared towards folks of with lesser means. What do we expect?
It is. It's low income housing. So let me ask you, Pat, are you okay with low income housing now?
I'm okay with creating a marketplace which allows people to build housing that's viable to the people who are putting their money and investing in it. And by the way, a significant portion of that in places like Providence and Pawtucket are people from the community themselves, making it easier for them, all right, to build out communities that have been just beaten. How? That's pretty simple. It's happening right now. Who gives you money? Right now, banks, the interest rate for purchase of homes and the terms are some of the most generous in American history, and the interest rates are incredibly low. And if you're talking about creating a model of rent to own or things like that, listen. If that revives the failed housing stock, I'm all for it. I'm all for talking about that. But let's let the private sector do it instead of the failed Rhode Island Treasury. That's the difference. Everything they touch. I'm just looking at facts. I'm just looking at results. Forget about the philosophy, the concepts. Whether you're blue or red or gold. Forget about all that. Just let's look at the results. I've given up on trying to. I've largely given up on trying to train people or teach people or educate people as to the beauties of the free market in this state, because they remain completely in denial about it, despite the fact that they're surrounded by a whole lot of people being lifted up in other states. And here, what were we talking about? It hasn't been published lately, but we were talking about food insecurity. By the way, that means starvation and malnutrition. We're looking at food insecurity rates of 40% here, according to published sources just a few months ago that have gone quiet, surprisingly. And why is that? Because we have a controlled economy. I'm sorry, go ahead, buddy.
It's so interesting, Pat, right? Like we're all friends on the call, and this is just a moment that I guess the listeners can listen to us, reflect, but there's so much that we can be on a call with and agree, right? That people should have more control over their lives, that people should be able to keep more of what they earn, and that people should be empowered with opportunities to make investments that can create legacy wealth for the generations that will follow. Like, there's so much that when we talk about fundamentally, we can agree on those values, on those ideas, but the notion of giving power to the people really, in my interpretation, your interpretation, seems to diverge slightly. I do not believe that empowering people with the ability to build their own homes, to select their education necessarily means that it's only achievable through some private sector mechanism, because we've seen the private sector also abuse of consumers. We've seen monopolies take effect. We've seen mismanagement of funds in the private sector, and government have to come down. But when it's liquidated, the people that were ultimately taken advantage of see nothing back. So like I just have to say, like, while we get to a point where I think everyone on the call agrees, and where I'm left when you know, both in education and when we talk about affordable versus low income housing, is I believe the failure that we've seen in Rhode Island is a process failure. It's who is the allocator, who is the implementer, and who is ultimately the person that has the control. And I think it should be with the people, right? I think that you know, municipalities that have school systems, if they had the proper allocation of funds, places like Providence, and if the way that were structured in terms of who's using the funds and what kind of protections are in place to make sure those funds are going to students, I think that process, which we don't currently have well defined, can actually make our education system better. If we had allocation of, you know, housing dollars towards individuals and working with the banks to help them create homes, i.e. affordable housing, and completely demolish the low-income housing that has fungus and rot in Pawtucket and build something new, or help families build something new for themselves. Yes, I agree. But will the private sector do that? No, I don't think so. Why would anyone in the private sector give people something?
Oh, I can answer that very simply. I can answer that. When the private sector is largely the community that is in fact impacted by it, I know just from my life outside of radio, I deal with countless folks who are part of a community. And by that, I mean, you know, people of color, of people of a variety of the ethnic backgrounds and from around the world, who have used home ownership and real estate as one of the two most prevalent first steps upon arrival in this United States to begin entry into the middle class. The other one is restaurants. So I know countless young people who are taking advantage of the market in Rhode Island, who are landlords within the community, who are, for the profit motive, for that unholy profit motive, are rehabilitating projects and rehabilitating homes and renting them out to other people in the community, sometimes in their family, sometimes in their church family, sometimes just out in the community at large.
So but you know, Pat, we're talking about something different here. I just said about, you know, we're talking about people need to survive and live. The market entry to flip a house is still about $10,000 at best, and you have to have good credit to get a loan. Okay, so I understand the nature of using real estate to get into the middle class, but we're not talking about the same thing here.
Oh, I very much am. I'm talking about the ability of folks of lesser means to transform themselves, all right, because of the nature of free market competition. And I'm looking at the constant failure of public housing. And I mean, how many public housing projects have?
A single mother with 2 children, okay, trying to go through a retraining program to get a better job that's not paying them enough to address the cost of living, and still with the threat that if they make too much, they will not receive the food assistance that they need for their family, is not in a position, on average, based on statistics, to enter into the real estate market, flip a house, and or become a property manager. It's not that it hasn't happened before, Pat, but that is not a scalable model.
But there are plenty of people in the community, and there are plenty of people in that same community who are. And I understand the plight of the single mother completely. And I see the stupidity of the way that these folks' lives have been pushed into this, you know, any one of a number of shapes into the square hole that government assistance insists upon. Hey, there's a shock. Government assistance not doing a great job because of the simple absence of common sense of forcing folks into an assistance model with making it difficult for them to get out of it. Who's running that? Is that private industry? No. That's, again, a failure of government. We need to create at least a semblance. I'm not expecting it overnight, especially here in Rhode Island, despite the fact that we lag most of New England in just about everything. Again, let's never forget that pre-pandemic, 40 miles from our borders, less, was one of the hottest economies on the planet, and lifting up all sorts of folks. The notion of fighting for a minimum wage in Boston until the pandemic happened was laughable, because if you wanted to hire anybody, you had to pay more than the minimum wage. You simply had to. So again, we can continue to try and manage the situation with the same people. By the way, after the Johns Hopkins report, how many people got fired?
So Pat, sorry, Pat. I just want to be respectful also. I know Scott usually gives us a solid half an hour, and I really appreciate, Scott, your time today. And Pat, you, of course, as well, letting us stream. And look, for the last 2 minutes here, I'm gonna speak my piece, and it's gonna be literally peace, Pat, so establishing some peace here. At the end of the day, we all care about the future. Mm-hmm. And for me, when I think about the future and I visualize it, it is hard for me to not see it a single thing, a child, and what that child's perspective is in the world that they're living. And that is my own. That's coming from me, right? So when I say sustainable systems, when something gets to me and I'm passionate, it's ultimately because, that child is, in my mind, the question is that child the average child? Well, most of the people in that world have the opportunities that you're defining, Pat. And so for me, unless a plan helps me visualize that child that on average will have a sustainable system serving them, I just can't not somehow push back. But that's not on you, Pat. That's on me, right? That's coming from me. And so I don't want you to feel that what you're saying doesn't make logical sense. I just, I think as we move forward, we really got to come together, and even the libertarians that can be as far out as they want to be, can come together, and we can create some hybrid version to all of this. So with that, that was my piece, but I want to give you all 30 seconds, 45 seconds, whatever you want to say your piece today.
Scott, so you go. You've been the referee tonight.
You guys can catch me every Monday night, 990wbob.com on the Rotunda. Variety of topics. I actually talked with a college hockey coach yesterday out in Alaska, whose program is in danger of cancellation. I've got an international recording artist calling in from Australia next week. I've got some upcoming shows coming up. I'm working on doing one on the effects of addiction and one man's journey out of addiction, and also the effects of workplace bullying. So some pretty cool stuff. I mean, not that workplace bullying is cool, but just, the fact that it's being talked about and being combated. So definitely check it out.
CoalitionRadioNetwork.com. You can find all sorts of stuff. Listen, we're amping up the website news coverage. You'll see we've set up a section on the page to report on the comings and goings of our federal delegation, congressmen and senators. I have to say that the media organization behind David Cicilline is pretty active. They chew out a pretty significant amount of stuff. More credit to them. I don't always agree with them, obviously, but more credit to them. We are working on adding some more shows. We're on about 4.5 nights a week. You can start listening in around 7, and you'll see all sorts of great stuff, including this show. Just in closing, on the issue at hand, I want nothing but the best for children. I see this generational abuse by government limiting the success of children from all communities. And I believe that all kids are superheroes. It's just a question of finding out what their superhero talent is, right? Like right out of the movies. We'll find out which ones are math superheroes, which ones are medical superheroes, which ones are community, religion. All of them are superheroes. And I just see generation after generation here in Rhode Island being sidelined. And we keep saying we're going to make all these changes within the existing system. Again, what's the term? The soft bigotry of diminished expectations. What we're allowing to take place in cities like Pawtucket, CF, Providence, West Warwick. Well, yeah, let's talk about West Warwick. Let's talk about parts of Newport. which face a lot of challenges. Newport isn't always the city of the rich and famous. Around Rhode Island, there's one consistent result. Our children are being poorly prepared for a hyper-competitive planet that has become only more difficult since I've been young. And I just don't see the people in charge. I just don't see them, Dr. Munoz. I appreciate your optimism. I just don't see them either capable or willing to make the changes necessary within the existing framework to give all these children an opportunity, regardless of these children's economic background, what part of the world they come from. I'm an open borders, open school kind of guy. Let's let people
look out for 2022.
Okay, I understand that reference, and I embrace it, and I can't wait. I can't wait for all of that to begin, because, well, let's just say this: there's nothing exciting on the current governmental landscape, is there? I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, again, we're all friends. I think that this discourse and the example that we're showing in terms of being able to engage in a passionate discussion and to ultimately come out with an understanding of the different approaches, right? The nuances around progress. I think in a weird way, we actually did achieve that. We just actually showed an example of how it takes to what it takes to get there sometimes. So I thank you both for the longer show. Thank you to our listeners who have been listening. And again, just remember, we're here to amplify the voices of communities. Hopefully we've succeeded today, and hopefully we've emboldened you to do the same. Have a great evening, and see you next week on Pump Up the Volume.